The small wooden cabin stood alone against the vast Dakota sky, its weathered logs telling stories of harsh winters and brief, beautiful summers. Inside, 12-year-old Annie stoked the morning fire, her movements practiced and efficient. 4 years had passed since the fever took her parents, leaving her to face the frontier alone. Annie paused to look out the window at the misty morning. The Missouri River snaked through the landscape just beyond her small vegetable garden. That river marked more than just a natural boundary. It separated the world of settlers like her from the Lakota people who still called the western lands home. Most days, Annie spoke to no one but her chickens. She named each one, though she tried not to get too attached. Life on the frontier taught hard lessons about survival. Her closest neighbors, the Johnson family, lived 2 miles away and checked on her when they could. But they had 7 children of their own to mind. "Looks like rain today," Annie murmured to herself, studying the heavy clouds. She pulled her faded blue shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. It had been her mother's, and wearing it made Annie feel less alone. Annie's days followed the same pattern: tend the chickens, work in the garden, repair what needed fixing, and trade with passing merchants when supplies ran low. She had learned to shoot her father's old rifle, though bullets were precious and saved for true emergencies. Most nights she fell asleep to the lonely howl of distant wolves. But Annie carried something special inside her, memories of her father's wisdom. He had been the only doctor for miles around, and he never turned away anyone in need, settler or native. "Wounds don't care what language you speak," he used to say when treating Lakota people who occasionally sought his help. "The body speaks its own language," Annie whispered, remembering his words as she gathered her small basket to collect eggs. The morning air bit at her cheeks, still cold despite spring's arrival. The chickens clucked and scattered as she approached their simple coop. After gathering 6 brown eggs, Annie noticed dark clouds gathering. Spring storms could be fierce, and the river often rose quickly. She hurried to collect firewood before the rain came, walking along the riverbank where fallen branches were plentiful. The Missouri looked angry today, swollen with melting snow from the mountains far away. Annie watched the churning water with respect. Her father had taught her to swim one summer when the river was gentle, but now it roared with dangerous currents that could sweep away even the strongest man. As she bent to pick up a thick branch, something caught her eye across the water. At first she thought it might be a deer coming to drink, but the movement was different. Squinting against the gray light, Annie realized it was a person, a girl by the looks of her, wearing fringed buckskin clothing that marked her as Lakota. The girl moved with obvious pain, limping badly as she made her way to the river's edge. Even from this distance, Annie could see she was young, perhaps 14 or 15. What caught Annie's attention most was the look of determination on the girl's face as she stared across the raging water. "She can't be thinking of crossing," Annie whispered in disbelief, but that's exactly what the native girl seemed to be considering. She tested the water with one moccasined foot, then looked upstream and down as if searching for a better spot to attempt the dangerous crossing. Without thinking, Annie dropped her firewood and waved her arms. "Stop!" she shouted across the water. "The river's too high. You'll drown!" The Lakota girl froze, startled by the voice. She spotted Annie on the opposite bank and stood watching warily. Annie wasn't sure if the girl understood English, but the warning in her voice must have carried across. Annie pointed at the rushing water, then made a swimming motion with her arms before drawing her finger across her throat in the universal sign for danger. The native girl seemed to understand. She pointed downstream urgently, then to herself, her face filled with worry. In that moment, Annie remembered her father saying that fear and pain looked the same in any language. This girl needed to cross for some important reason, despite her injured leg. And if she tried swimming in that current, Annie's heart pounded as she made her decision. Behind her cabin, tied to a sturdy oak, was her father's old rowboat. He had built it years ago for fishing and crossing the river during calmer seasons. Annie rarely used it alone. The current was tricky even in good conditions, but something told her this was important. "Wait there," she called, pointing to the spot where the girl stood before running back toward her cabin. The girl might not understand the words, but Annie hoped her meaning was clear. The boat was heavier than she remembered, and dragging it to the water took all her strength. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Annie untied the rope and pushed off from the muddy bank. The current immediately grabbed the small craft, trying to pull it downstream. Annie's arms burned as she fought against the river's strength. Each stroke of the oars felt like pushing against a wall, but slowly, inch by inch, she made progress toward the far shore. The rain fell harder now, pelting her face and making it difficult to see. When she finally reached the western bank, Annie was breathing hard. Up close, she could see the native girl more clearly. Dark eyes wide with a mixture of caution and hope, black hair in 2 long braids and a crude splint made of sticks and leather strips around her ankle. Annie gestured to the boat. The girl hesitated only briefly before limping forward. She winced with each step, but managed to climb into the small craft with Annie's help. Up close, Annie could smell the pine and herbs on the girl's clothing. Getting back across proved even harder with the added weight. The river seemed determined to claim them, pulling the boat sideways despite Annie's best efforts. Halfway across, water began splashing over the sides. The Lakota girl, seeing their danger, used a small wooden bowl from Annie's supplies to bail water while Annie rowed. Together, they fought the river's power. Annie's arms felt like they might tear from their sockets, but she refused to give up. The native girl's eyes never left Annie's face, as if drawing strength from the younger girl's determination. When they finally bumped against the eastern shore, both girls were soaked and shivering. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the ground to mud beneath their feet. Annie helped the limping girl up the slope toward the cabin. As they reached the door, thunder cracked overhead, making both of them jump. They looked at each other and, despite everything, shared a small smile, the first moment of connection between 2 worlds that had long stood apart. Inside the cabin's warmth, Annie stoked the fire higher and hung their wet outer clothes to dry. The Lakota girl stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, taking in the strange surroundings with curious eyes. She had probably never been inside a settler's home before. Annie moved slowly, careful not to frighten her unexpected guest. She pointed to herself and said clearly, "Annie." The native girl watched her for a long moment before touching her own chest. "Zena," she said softly, her voice like the gentle rustling of leaves. Outside, the storm raged on. The river continued to rise, and somewhere in the distance 30 warriors began following tracks that led to the water's edge. But inside the small cabin, 2 girls from different worlds had taken the first step toward understanding. The fire crackled in the small stone fireplace as rain pounded against the cabin's roof. Annie watched as Zena examined her surroundings with cautious curiosity. The native girl's dark eyes widened at the sight of books stacked on a crude shelf, the iron cooking pot hanging over the fire, and the small mirror on the wall, objects from a world entirely different from her own. Annie gestured to Zena's injured ankle. "May I?" she asked, miming looking at the injury. Zena hesitated, then gave a small nod. She eased herself onto a wooden stool as Annie knelt to examine the makeshift splint. Carefully, Annie unwrapped the leather bindings and sticks. The ankle was swollen and bruised, but didn't appear broken. Her father had taught her enough about injuries to recognize a bad sprain when she saw one. "Wait here," Annie said, though she knew Zena couldn't understand her words. She went to a small trunk in the corner where she kept her father's medical supplies, precious items she'd preserved since his death. From it, she took a jar of salve made from arnica and other herbs, clean cloth strips, and 2 sturdy pieces of flat wood her father had shaped for splinting. As Annie worked on the injured ankle, Zena watched her hands intently. The native girl winced when Annie applied pressure to test the injury, but remained still otherwise. Trust was building between them, fragile as a bird's egg but just as full of possibility. Using gestures and simple drawings in the dirt on the floor, Annie and Zena began to communicate. Annie learned that Zena had fallen while gathering medicinal plants up in the hills. She had been with her younger brother, a boy of maybe 7 or 8, but they'd become separated in the forest. Zena's greatest worry was for his safety. The rain continued to fall as afternoon faded into evening. Annie prepared a simple meal of cornbread and dried rabbit stew. Zena accepted the strange food cautiously, sniffing it first before taking a small bite. Her eyes widened with surprise at the taste, and Annie couldn't help but smile. After eating, Zena pointed urgently toward the river and then to herself, making it clear she needed to leave. Annie shook her head and pointed to the window where rain still streamed down in sheets. The river would be even more dangerous now, perhaps impossible to cross. Tomorrow would be safer. Zena's shoulders slumped with worry, but she nodded in reluctant agreement. She reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a handful of what looked like dried berries, offering them to Annie. Annie took one and tasted it, sweet with a hint of tartness unlike anything she'd eaten before. The girls shared a small smile at this exchange of gifts. As darkness fell, Annie arranged blankets near the fire for Zena. The native girl examined the woven wool with fascination, running her fingers over the pattern. In turn, she showed Annie her moccasins, pointing out the intricate beadwork that decorated the soft leather. That night, as wind howled around the cabin corners, Annie lay awake thinking about how quickly life could change. Yesterday she had been completely alone. Today, a girl from a world entirely different from her own was sleeping by her hearth. For the first time since her parents died, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Morning brought watery sunshine and a world washed clean by the storm. The river had risen even higher during the night, its angry roar audible even from inside the cabin. Annie stood at the window watching the churning brown water with concern. Zena joined her face falling at the sight. She made swimming motions, then pointed to herself and across the river with a questioning look. Annie shook her head firmly. "Too dangerous," she said, making exaggerated motions to indicate the strength of the current. "Maybe tomorrow." She held up one finger, then pointed to where the sun would rise the next day. Zena's distress was obvious. She pointed repeatedly in the direction Annie assumed was her village, then made rocking motions with her arms as if holding a child. Her brother, Annie realized. The poor girl was frantic with worry for him. Through gestures and simple drawings scratched on the wooden table with a piece of charcoal, Zena explained that her people would be searching for both her and her brother. If they found signs that she had crossed the river but not returned, they might think she had drowned. Annie chewed her lip, thinking hard. She couldn't let Zena try to cross the raging river. It would be certain death. But perhaps there was another way to send a message. Her mind raced through possibilities until an idea struck her. She motioned for Zena to follow her outside. Behind the cabin, in a small lean-to, Annie kept her father's hunting supplies. Among them was a small bow he had traded for with a passing Pawnee hunter years ago. It wasn't large, but it was powerful enough to send an arrow high and far. Annie picked up the bow and a single arrow with bright red feathers. She pointed to the far shore, mimed shooting the arrow, and then pointed to Zena with a questioning look. Would her people recognize something of hers if they found it? Understanding dawned in Zena's eyes. She quickly untied one of the decorated leather strips from her hair and wrapped it around the shaft of the arrow. She added a small wooden bead from her pouch, one carved with marks Annie didn't understand but which clearly meant something to Zena. Together, they walked to the edge of the property, as close to the river as they dared on the muddy ground. Annie hadn't used the bow much, but her father had taught her its basics. She nocked the arrow, drew back the string with all her strength, and aimed high above the opposite bank. The arrow flew in a graceful arc, disappearing into the trees on the far side. Zena watched its flight with hope in her eyes. She squeezed Annie's hand in thanks, the first real physical contact between them. Back in the cabin, the day passed with small discoveries. Annie showed Zena how to card wool from her sheep and spin it into thread. In turn, Zena demonstrated how she wove reeds into small watertight baskets. Despite the language barrier, they developed a rhythm of working together, communicating through gestures, expressions, and the occasional word that one would teach the other. By late afternoon, Annie noticed Zena repeatedly looking out the window toward the west, her face tense with worry. Following her gaze, Annie spotted something that made her heart skip, a thin spiral of smoke rising from the trees across the river. Someone was there, perhaps searching for Zena. Annie pointed to the smoke, and Zena's face lit up with recognition. She nodded vigorously and made a gesture that Annie interpreted as, "My people." The native girl limped to the door, clearly wanting to get closer to the river to look. Supporting Zena with a shoulder under her arm, Annie helped her walk to a small rise where they could see better. On the opposite bank, just visible through the trees, were two figures on horseback. They appeared to be examining the ground, perhaps following tracks. Zena cupped her hands around her mouth and called out in her language, a melodic series of sounds that carried across the water. The mounted figures snapped to attention, looking in their direction. One raised an arm in acknowledgement. Through an elaborate pantomime, Zena explained that these were scouts from her tribe. Now that they knew she was alive and where she was, they would bring others, including someone who could help her cross when the water was safer. That night, Annie and Xena sat by the fire, a new sense of ease between them. Xena taught Annie words in her language, words for fire, water, friend. Annie showed Xena her mother's old picture book, one with illustrations of animals and plants. As they prepared for sleep, Annie realized something had changed inside her. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 4 years had lifted slightly. By helping Xena, she had connected with another person in a way she hadn't since her parents died. Outside in the darkness, unseen by either girl, more smoke signals rose from the western bank. The scouts had spread the word. By dawn, the search party would arrive in full force. 30 warriors led by a worried father, coming for the chief's daughter, who had been missing for 2 days. And the little orphan who had risked the raging river to save her had no idea what morning would bring. Annie woke to the sound of birdsong. For a moment she forgot about her visitor until she heard soft breathing from the pallet near the hearth. Xena was still asleep, her face peaceful in the gray dawn light that filtered through the small window. Moving quietly, Annie stepped outside to check the river. The water level had dropped overnight, but the current still ran swift and dangerous. As she stood watching the churning water, something on the far bank caught her eye. Movement among the trees. Annie squinted, her breath catching as figures emerged from the forest. Men on horseback, at least a dozen visible now, with more appearing behind them. They wore buckskin clothing similar to Xena's, some with feathers in their hair, others with faces painted in bold colors. Warriors. One rider moved ahead of the others, a tall man on a spotted horse. Even from this distance, Annie could see the authority in his bearing. He raised a hand and the entire group halted at the river's edge. Heart pounding, Annie hurried back to the cabin. Xena was awake now, sitting up and rewrapping her ankle with the clean bandage Annie had given her. "They're here," Annie said, pointing toward the door and then making a motion to indicate many people. "Your people." Xena's eyes widened. She struggled to her feet, accepting Annie's supporting arm as they made their way outside. When she saw the gathering across the river, Xena called out in her language, words that carried clearly across the water. The man on the spotted horse responded, his deep voice booming over the sound of the river. Though Annie couldn't understand the words, she recognized the relief in his tone. Xena answered him at length, gesturing repeatedly toward Annie and the cabin, then to her bandaged ankle. More warriors had appeared, until Annie counted 30 in all. Some carried spears, others bows, though none had weapons drawn. They formed an imposing line along the opposite bank, watching the two girls with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. "Who is he?" Annie asked, pointing to the man on the spotted horse who seemed to be in charge. Xena touched her chest, then pointed to the man, making a cradling motion with her arms. Her father, Annie realized, and judging by the respect shown by the other warriors, not just any father, an important man, perhaps a chief. The man spoke again, gesturing upstream. In response, 2 warriors broke away from the group and rode off in that direction. Xena explained through gestures that they were seeking a safer crossing point. While they waited, Xena drew in the dirt with a stick, creating a rough map. She showed Annie the location of her village, perhaps a day's journey from the river. She drew a small figure representing her brother, then pointed west with a questioning look in her eyes. "They found him?" Annie asked, mimicking the search motions Xena had used earlier. Xena nodded vigorously, her face breaking into a relieved smile. She made a motion of someone small running back to a group, then sleeping safely. Her brother had returned to the village on his own, which had triggered the search for Xena when she didn't follow. The morning sun climbed higher as they waited. Annie went inside briefly to fetch bread and dried meat, which she offered to Xena. They sat on a fallen log near the cabin, sharing the simple meal and watching the warriors across the water. "Why do they have paint on their faces?" Annie asked, pointing to her own cheeks and then toward the warriors. Xena touched invisible lines on her face, then made motions of tracking and hunting. The paint had meaning for tracking or a search party, Annie guessed, not for war as she had initially feared. After about an hour, the 2 warriors who had ridden upstream returned. They spoke to the chief, gesturing animatedly. The chief considered their report, then called out to Xena. She listened carefully before turning to Annie. Through an elaborate series of gestures, Xena explained that the warriors had found a place where the river narrowed and the current slowed, about a mile upstream. They would cross there and come to meet them at the cabin. Annie felt a flutter of nervousness. She had never been this close to native warriors before. Stories circulated among settlers about raids and violence, though her father had always said there were good and bad people in every group. Still, the thought of 30 warriors arriving at her doorstep was intimidating. Xena seemed to sense Annie's unease. She placed a reassuring hand on the younger girl's arm and smiled, making a protective gesture that needed no translation. "You helped me. They will not harm you." Together they returned to the cabin to wait. Annie busied herself tidying up while Xena sat by the window, watching for her people. The silence between them was comfortable now, like that of old friends who didn't need constant chatter. The sound of hoofbeats announced the warriors' arrival an hour later. Annie stood nervously by the hearth as shadows darkened the doorway. Xena rose to her feet, standing tall despite her injured ankle, and called out a greeting. The chief entered first, ducking his head to pass through the low doorway. Up close he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with lines of wisdom etched around his eyes and 2 eagle feathers in his long black hair. He wore a necklace of bear claws and carried himself with natural dignity. Behind him came 2 other men, younger but with a family resemblance to both the chief and Xena. Brothers or uncles, Annie guessed. The rest of the warriors remained outside, their shadows visible through the windows as they formed a protective circle around the cabin. Xena spoke rapidly to her father, gesturing toward Annie repeatedly. The chief listened without interrupting, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the cabin and the small orphan girl who stood her ground, despite her obvious fear. When Xena finished speaking, the cabin fell silent. The chief studied Annie for a long moment before speaking directly to her in his language. Though Annie couldn't understand the words, the tone was solemn and formal. Xena stepped forward to translate in her limited way. She pointed to her father, then to Annie, and made a gesture of thanks. Next, she mimed Annie rowing the boat across the dangerous river, then tending to her injured ankle. The chief nodded and reached into a pouch at his waist. He withdrew something that caught the light, a necklace of polished stones and intricate beadwork. With formal movements, he held it out to Annie. Annie hesitated, unsure of the proper response. Xena nodded encouragingly, so Annie stepped forward and accepted the gift with both hands, as she had seen Xena do when receiving something from her father. The chief spoke again, this time placing his hand over his heart and then extending it toward Annie. The meaning was clear even without words: gratitude and respect. One of the younger men said something that made Xena laugh. She turned to Annie and pantomimed eating and drinking, then pointed to outside where the warriors waited. They were inviting her to share a meal with them. With Xena limping beside her, Annie stepped out of her cabin into the bright midday sun. The warriors had dismounted and made a temporary camp in the clearing. Some were tending to the horses. Others had started a small cooking fire. They paused in their activities to watch as Annie emerged with their chief and his daughter. What struck Annie most was how ordinary it all seemed. Despite their different clothing and language, these were simply people caring for one of their own. The worry lines on the chief's face were those of any father concerned for his child. The gentle way one of the older warriors checked Xena's bandaged ankle reminded Annie of her own father tending to patients. As Annie accepted a wooden bowl of stew made from deer meat and wild onions, she realized something profound had changed. The river had always been a boundary in her mind, not just a physical division but a line between us and them. Now, sitting cross-legged between Xena and a young warrior who was patiently teaching her words in his language, that line seemed less important. Across the clearing, the chief watched the little orphan girl who had saved his daughter. He saw courage in her small frame and wisdom beyond her years in her eyes. Such spirit deserved recognition. As the sun began its westward journey, the chief made a decision. He called his daughter and 2 trusted warriors to his side. Through Xena's gestures and the few shared words they had established, he made an offer to Annie that would change her life forever. The little orphan who had helped a limping native girl cross the river was about to discover that kindness could build bridges stronger than any current could tear down. The chief's offer was simple yet profound. Through Xena's careful translations of gestures and the few shared words they now understood, Annie learned that she was being invited to visit their village. Not just for a brief time, but to stay for several days as an honored guest of the chief's family. Annie sat quietly, turning the invitation over in her mind. No settler she knew had ever been welcomed into a Lakota village as a guest. Fear and mistrust ran too deep on both sides, yet here was the chance to step across that invisible line, to see a world few from her background had ever witnessed. When? She asked, pointing to the sun and making a circular motion. The chief held up 3 fingers, then pointed to where the sun would rise. 3 days from now. He added more gestures, explaining that Xena needed time to rest her ankle before traveling, and preparations needed to be made at the village. Annie nodded her acceptance, her heart racing with both excitement and nervousness. The chief seemed pleased with her answer. He spoke to his warriors, and several of them departed immediately, presumably to bring news back to the village and begin preparations. The remaining warriors, including the chief and his sons, set up camp near Annie's cabin. As evening approached, they built a proper fire and shared stories that, despite the language barrier, made Annie laugh at their animated tellings. One warrior was particularly skilled at mimicking animals, his body transforming as he became a stalking mountain lion or a lumbering bear. That night, Annie lay awake long after the sounds of conversation had died down outside. The necklace the chief had given her rested on a small shelf above her bed. Its polished stones caught the moonlight that streamed through her window. What would her parents think of her accepting this invitation? Her father, she was certain, would have approved. He had always seen beyond the boundaries others accepted without question. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of activity. The warriors helped Annie secure her cabin and chicken coop for her absence. One of them, an older man with gentle hands, showed her how to set snares that would keep rabbits from her garden while she was gone. Annie, in turn, shared what little she had, fresh eggs from her chickens and vegetables from her small garden. Xena stayed in the cabin with Annie, her ankle improving daily thanks to rest and the herbal poultice Annie's father had taught her to make. The girls spent hours teaching each other words in their respective languages. By the second day, they could carry on simple conversations, their hands filling in what their words couldn't express. Annie learned that Xena was indeed the chief's daughter, and that her name meant spirit of the wind in her language. Xena's younger brother, the one she had been so worried about, was called Little Fox for his clever ways and red-tinged hair, unusual among their people and considered special. "My father says you have strong medicine," Xena told Annie on the evening before their departure, patting her healing ankle. "Not here," she touched her pouch of herbs, "but here." She placed her hand over her heart. Annie smiled, understanding what Xena meant. Her father had always said that healing came as much from kindness as from knowledge. "Your father is wise," she replied in Xena's language, the words still awkward on her tongue. Xena beamed with pride, both at the compliment to her father and at Annie's use of her language. "Tomorrow," she said, pointing westward, "you will see how my people live." Dawn broke clear and cool on the 3rd day. Annie had packed a small bundle of clothing and a few precious items: her mother's hairbrush, her father's small book of medicinal plants, and a tiny wooden horse he had carved for her on her 8th birthday. The rest of her preparations had been practical, securing the cabin, storing food properly, and making sure her chickens had enough feed in their coop to last until the Johnsons came to check on them. The warriors broke camp efficiently, leaving no trace of their presence except a circle of stone from their fire pit, which one of the older men had carefully arranged into a pattern Annie didn't understand, but recognized as deliberate. The chief approached Annie as she locked her cabin door. He gestured to one of the horses, a gentle-looking mare with a dappled coat. The meaning was clear. This horse would carry Annie to the village. Annie had ridden before, but rarely, and never such a fine horse. With help from one of the younger warriors, she mounted awkwardly. The horse stood patiently as she found her balance and gripped the simple leather reins. Xena, despite her injured ankle, mounted her own horse with practiced ease. She guided her pony alongside Annie's and smiled reassuringly. "My father has given you Cloud Dancer to ride," she explained, patting the dappled mare's neck. "She is gentle and wise on the trail." The journey began with the crossing of the river at the narrower point upstream. The water level had fallen further, making the passage manageable, though still dangerous. The warriors formed a protective line around Annie and Xena as they forded the river. ensuring the current wouldn't sweep them away. As they climbed the western bank, Annie turned to look back at her cabin, a small rectangle of weathered logs that had been her entire world for so long. From this distance, it looked tiny and vulnerable against the vast landscape. Yet for the first time since her parents' death, she was leaving it without fear gripping her heart. The trail westward led through rolling hills covered with spring wildflowers. Annie had never ventured this far from her home. Each new vista brought something to marvel at. A family of deer bounding through a meadow, an eagle soaring overhead, a small waterfall tumbling down rocks into a crystal-clear pool. The warriors maintained a watchful guard as they traveled, 2 scouts always riding ahead while others flanked the group. Yet the atmosphere wasn't tense. Several of the younger men raced their horses across open ground, whooping with the pure joy of speed. Others pointed out interesting sights to Annie. A particular rock formation shaped like a bear's head, a tree struck by lightning that had continued to grow in a twisted spiral. By midday, they stopped in a sheltered valley to rest the horses and eat. The food was simple: dried meat, some kind of flatbread, and berries preserved from the previous autumn. Annie found herself relaxing in the warriors' presence, no longer intimidated by their painted faces or the weapons they carried. As they resumed their journey, the landscape began to change. The hills grew steeper, with stands of pine and spruce instead of the open grasslands near the river. Zena explained that their summer village lay in a protected valley where game was plentiful and a clean river provided water. In winter, we go to the sheltered canyons, she told Annie, but spring and summer, we stay here where the hunting is good. Late afternoon brought the first sight of the village. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns above a collection of teepees arranged in a large circle. From a ridge overlooking the valley, Annie could see people moving about. Women working outside the teepees, children playing, men gathered in groups. The chief raised his hand, and one of the warriors blew a horn made from a buffalo's horn. The deep sound echoed across the valley, announcing their return. Almost immediately, people began gathering at the edge of the village, shading their eyes to look up at the returning party. "They wait for us," Zena said, excitement in her voice. "My brother will be watching for me." As they descended into the valley, Annie felt a flutter of nervousness. What would Zena's people think of a settler girl in their midst? Would they welcome her as the warriors had, or view her with suspicion? Zena seemed to sense her worry. "You saved the daughter of Grey Wolf," she said, using her father's name. "That makes you family." The welcoming party grew as they approached the village. Women and children lined the path, staring openly at Annie with her pale skin and light brown hair. Some of the smaller children ducked behind their mothers when she looked their way, while older ones pointed and whispered questions. At the center of the gathering stood a small boy with a shock of hair that indeed had a reddish tint in the sunlight. He bounced on his toes with barely contained energy, his eyes fixed on Zena. The moment they entered the village proper, he broke free from the woman who had been holding his hand and ran straight for his sister's horse. Zena slid from her mount and caught him in a tight embrace, lifting him off his feet despite her injured ankle. The boy's rapid-fire questions made her laugh as she set him down and turned him toward Annie. "This is my brother, Little Fox," she said in English for Annie's benefit. Then, in her own language, she explained to the boy, "This is Annie. She saved me from the river and healed my leg." Little Fox studied Annie solemnly for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. He said something that made Zena laugh again. "He says you must be magic to have crossed the angry river," Zena translated. "And he wants to know if your hair feels like sunlight." Annie smiled and dismounted carefully. She knelt to the boy's level and inclined her head, inviting him to touch her hair. Little Fox reached out with cautious fingers to stroke the light brown strands, his eyes wide with wonder. That simple moment of connection, a curious child and a gentle response, seemed to break the ice. The villagers moved forward, no longer hanging back. An elderly woman took Annie's hands in hers, examining the calluses with knowing fingers before nodding approval. A group of girls about Zena's age crowded around, asking questions she couldn't understand, but recognizing their friendly intent. As the chief led Annie toward a large teepee at the center of the village, she realized something profound. Despite everything she'd been taught to fear about these people, despite the stories settlers told around their fires, she felt safer in this moment than she had since her parents died. The little orphan who had helped a limping, native girl cross the river had crossed a different kind of river herself, one made of prejudice and fear. And on this shore, she found not enemies but simply people, with the same capacity for kindness she had shown to one of their own. The days Annie spent in the Lakota village opened her eyes to a way of life both different from and surprisingly similar to her own. The chief's teepee, where she was given a place of honor, was spacious and warm, decorated with painted scenes of hunts and spirit journeys. Zena's mother, a quiet woman with kind eyes and nimble fingers, welcomed Annie with a gift of soft moccasins to replace her worn boots. Each morning began with the village coming, alive as women rekindled cooking fires and men gathered to discuss hunting plans or repairs needed around the camp. Children ran freely between the teepees, their laughter a universal sound that needed no translation. Little Fox appointed himself Annie's personal guide, proudly showing her everything from the best climbing trees to the special clay at the riverbank that could be molded into small figures. "He has adopted you as a second sister," Zena explained on the third day, as they watched the boy demonstrating how to shoot a child-sized bow for Annie's benefit. "He tells everyone you walked through thunder to save me." Annie smiled, watching the boy's serious concentration as he aimed at a target made from a stuffed deerskin bag. "I like having a brother," she said simply. The words brought a sudden pang. She had always wished for siblings before the fever took her parents. Zena squeezed her hand in understanding. Over their growing friendship, Annie had shared the story of losing her family, and Zena had listened with the quiet respect of someone who understood that some pain never fully heals. Annie's days were filled with learning. An elderly woman taught her how to identify plants that could heal fevers and wounds. Zena's mother showed her how to prepare hides using traditional methods that left the leather softer than any Annie had felt. She learned words in the Lakota language, adding to the small vocabulary she and Zena had developed. But perhaps the most important lessons came during the evenings around the central fire, when the village gathered to share stories. Though she couldn't understand all the words, the universal language of storytelling, the expressions, the voices rising and falling, the reactions of the listeners, needed no translation. One night, the chief's oldest brother, a man whose face was mapped with lines of experience, told a tale that Zena quietly translated for Annie. It was the story of how their people came to this land generations ago, following visions that led them to these hunting grounds. The tale was told with such vivid detail that Annie could almost see the ancestors making their journey across unfamiliar terrain, guided by faith and determination. When he finished, the storyteller looked directly at Annie and spoke a few words that made the gathering fall silent. "What did he say?" Annie whispered to Zena. "He says every journey changes the traveler," Zena replied, "and that sometimes the greatest journeys are those that cross the rivers we build in our minds." Annie nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. The river that had once seemed an uncrossable boundary between her world and Zena's now felt like just a strip of water, no more significant than the small stream that ran near the village where children played. On the fifth day, as Annie helped the women prepare a feast to honor a successful hunt, a commotion at the edge of the village caught everyone's attention. 3 riders had arrived, their horses lathered from hard riding. Annie recognized one as Mr. Johnson, her closest neighbor from across the river. The men were met by the village's warriors, and though there was tension in the air, no weapons were drawn. The chief stepped forward to speak with the newcomers. Annie watched from a distance, her heart racing as she realized the men must be looking for her. Zena appeared at her side. "Your people have come," she said. "They feared you were taken." The thought had never occurred to Annie, that her neighbors might discover her empty cabin and assume the worst. The Johnsons checked on her every week or so, and finding her gone with signs of multiple horses and a campfire nearby, they had jumped to frightening conclusions. The chief gestured for Annie to approach. As she walked forward, Mr. Johnson's weather-beaten face showed first disbelief, then enormous relief. "Annie, girl, you're alive," he called out. "We thought—" He broke off, looking around at the Lakota warriors who stood watching. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mr. Johnson," Annie said, suddenly aware of how strange this must look to him. A settler girl in moccasins, staying willingly in a native village. "These people are my friends. Zena was hurt and I helped her. Her father invited me to visit. Mr. Johnson and his companions exchanged bewildered looks. In all their years on the frontier, they had never heard of such a thing. The chief spoke, and Zena stepped forward to translate. My father says you are welcome to stay and share our food. Any friend of Annie's is a friend of our village. The invitation clearly caught the settlers off guard. They dismounted cautiously, keeping close to their horses as if unsure whether to accept. The chief remained patient, his dignified bearing making it clear this was a sincere offer of hospitality. Slowly, the tension eased. Mr. Johnson, who had fought in skirmishes against native tribes years before, found himself accepting a pipe offered by one of the older warriors. His companions, though still wary, allowed themselves to be guided to seats by the central fire. Annie moved between the two groups, helping to bridge the enormous gap of mistrust and misunderstanding. She explained to Mr. Johnson how Zena had been injured and separated from her brother, how Annie had helped her cross the river, and how the warriors had come searching for the chief's daughter. They've been nothing but kind to me, she insisted. They have so much to teach us, Mr. Johnson, and I think we have things to teach them too. As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. The settlers relaxed enough to share the coffee they had brought in their saddlebags, a treat the Lakota accepted with interest. One of Mr. Johnson's companions, a young man named Tom who had a gift for music, pulled out a harmonica and began to play. The sweet, mournful tunes needed no translation, and soon one of the Lakota men brought out a small drum to accompany him. Two forms of music, born from entirely different traditions, found a way to blend together under the star-filled sky. Later, as the settlers prepared to depart with promises to return the next day to escort Annie home, the chief took her aside. Through Zena's translation, he made an offer that took Annie's breath away. My father says the river separates our peoples, but it does not need to divide our hearts, Zena explained. He offers that you may come to learn with us whenever you wish, and in return, perhaps you could teach some of our young ones your medicine and your ways with growing things. The chief held out his hand in the settler way of sealing agreements, a gesture he had observed and now offered as a sign of respect. Annie took his large hand in her small one, feeling the strength and gentleness in his grip. I would be honored, she said, the words coming from her heart. 2 weeks later, Annie stood on the porch of her cabin, watching as 3 young Lakota women carefully tended the expanded garden they had helped her plant. Inside, Zena was teaching Mrs. Johnson how to prepare a healing salve for her husband's arthritic hands, while Little Fox showed the Johnson children how to make toy animals from corn husks. The river still flowed between the two communities, but it was no longer a boundary. It had become a meeting place. Twice a week, weather permitting, Annie held reading lessons under the old oak tree by the crossing point. Her students included both settler children and young Lakota, eager to understand the marks on paper that the white people valued so much. In return, Annie spent time in the village, learning traditional wisdom that her father would have treasured. She recorded it all in his old medical journal, which plants could stop bleeding, which barks eased pain, which roots strengthened the body against winter illness. Not everyone approved of this unusual arrangement. Some settlers from farther away muttered about going native when they passed through. Some of the more traditional Lakota elders kept their distance from the learning circles. But the chief's blessing carried weight, and the practical benefits of shared knowledge soon became obvious to even the most skeptical. When autumn came and the river rose again with early rains, Annie stood on her porch watching the sun set beyond the western hills. The necklace the chief had given her hung around her neck, its stones warm against her skin. From inside came the sound of laughter as Zena helped Little Fox with English words written on a slate. Tomorrow, several of the village women would come to help preserve the harvest from the garden. Next week, Annie would travel to the village to assist with preparing hides for winter clothing. The little orphan who had helped a Limping native girl cross the river had built something no one could have imagined, a bridge between worlds. And in doing so, she had found what she thought was lost forever, a family, one larger and more diverse than she could have ever dreamed possible. As the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Annie made a silent promise to her parents. She would use what they had taught her, courage, compassion, and curiosity, to keep building bridges wherever life took her. For she had learned that the strongest bridges weren't made of wood or stone, but of understanding and kindness. and those were the bridges that could truly change the world.